I'm not sure that if Russian forces marched through Kiev and all the way to the Polish border, that they would ever come to terms with reality. They are absolutely certain that this proxy war against Russia must continue. Now, that's Fantasy Island's view. And all of this without regard to the Ukrainian people, without regard to anyone there, without regard, I would argue, to Europeans in general. They could care less. All of it, as far as they're concerned, could become a war zone if it harms Russia. Hence, you see the stupidity in Finland, the stupidity in Sweden. So what is it in reality? In reality, the Ukrainian nation is probably dead. Millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians have left the country. They will never go back. The birth rate, which was already low, has now gone through the floor. I mean, people are simply not building families, and families are essential to the survival of any civilization and culture. Now we have the Procurator General, who finally admitted in public that the Ukrainians have lost 500,000 soldiers on the battlefield. Gosh, what a surprise. What has General Kuyat said? What have I said? What have others said who have any sense of reality? Ukraine is being destroyed. Now, could Ukraine be in worse shape? Of course. The Russians could have gone in and done in Ukraine what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. There's a difference. The Russians don't want to kill Slavic Orthodox Christians like themselves. They never have. By the way, the Russians don't want to kill Europeans. They want to do business with them. So this is not Gaza. All the terrible war crimes attributed to the Russians have not happened. In fact, if there are significant war crimes, they were committed by the Ukrainian forces, and we know who those people are. The sad truth of the matter is, I'm afraid Ukraine is finished as a nation state, but we will continue to pretend that it's something real until it absolutely is not. And the Russian forces are now advancing across the front, albeit slowly and deliberately. But I think even the truth has finally sunk in Moscow that they're not going to find a partner to talk to. And if they can't, they have to go to the Dnieper River and probably cross it and go into Kiev. And that is something that no one on the Russian side wants to do, because Kiev is practically a holy city in the history and culture of Russia. That is the beginning of Orthodox Christianity.
That's the Jerusalem of the Russian culture.
Yes, and so they don't want to fight in that city. And Zelensky could care less about those things. He's shut down Christianity in Ukraine. He's arrested people for it. This man is worse than the NKVD and the Bolsheviks. So they may still have to do that whether they like it or not. But there's no one in the West right now that's going to admit anything. Now, if something were to change in Washington, then I'm sure that many of the vassal states would go along with it. But I still think the so-called vassal European states are going to have change in their own governments. It's up to the Germans, the French, and everybody else to put an end to it. They've got to do it and got to come to terms with reality. But you and I know you're the voice in the wilderness. How many people get to listen to you, Roger? So what are they listening to every night on television? They're listening to lies, nonsense, fantasy. I think the Zelensky regime is falling apart. They're beginning to engage in mutual recrimination. The key people in the structure are attacking each other, blaming each other. The forces in the field, which have been crumbling slowly for many, many months, are now really falling apart very quickly. There is no appetite anywhere in Ukraine to send more men into action. There's great resistance to it. The secret police, the SBU, is rounding people up and shooting people, but it's not enough. At the same time, the population lives in mortal fear of the Zelensky regime. In fact, I spoke with someone who came back quite recently with
fantasy. I think the Zelensky regime is falling apart. They're beginning to engage in mutual recrimination. They're attacking key people in the structure, attacking each other, blaming each other. The forces in the field, which have been crumbling slowly for many, many months, are now really falling apart very quickly. There is no appetite anywhere in Ukraine to send more men into action. There's great resistance to it. The secret police, the SBU, is rounding people up and shooting people, but it's not enough. At the same time, the population lives in mortal fear of the Zelensky regime. In fact, I spoke with someone who came back quite recently within the last couple of days. who told me that the population in Ukraine is far more afraid of the SBU and the Zelinsky regime than they are of the Russians. And they all would like this to end, but you're never going to hear that in the mainstream media. But it goes where it is, as Zelensky seems to be very busy trying to close deals, selling off as much of Ukraine as he can to various agricultural conglomerates and BlackRock, headed by Larry Fink and others. I don't think it's going to last much longer. What's amazing to me, again, is that the Russians have exercised so much patience, and at some point, I think their hand will be forced. Putin's hand will be forced. He's going to have to close up the distance to the river. To be sure, they are going to retake Odessa. They will retake Kharkiv. Those things are already in planning and execution. In the case of Kharkiv, they've got about 110 to 120,000 troops moving towards Kharkiv right now. Of course, they have 90 to 100,000 headed to Dnipro. We'll see those things happen. The question is, what do you do about this cancer in Kyiv? If you're Putin, you've got to get rid of it. It would be nice if the Ukrainian military itself took things into hand and did something, but that hasn't happened, so at some point their hand will be forced. I know that the Russian General Staff is currently considering the mobilization of an additional 800,000 troops. Now, given that they're well over that number right now, what would they need an additional 800,000 troops to do? Well, if you get no agreement from the West, if no one will talk to you, if you cannot negotiate an end to this, you are compelled to march west. You will have to grudgingly cross the Dnieper River and hope that once you cross and start heading west, people will take you seriously. I mean, the recent photographs and news about tactical nuclear weapons being moved further west inside Russia, that's not designed to frighten everybody per se, because they have no interest in using those things. It's a demonstration of resolve. And it's telling us that if you contemplate attacking us, we will deliver total war and you will not win. I mean, that's the message. We hold a very weak hand. There's a reason that Chancellor Scholz and his colleagues have all laughed off Mr. Macron and his ridiculous statement about sending European forces or NATO forces into Ukraine. We certainly won't. We just cut 24,000 spaces out of the army. The U.S. Army is now 450,000. That's a smaller number than the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed in the war. And now that number is out. I'm told now it's over 500,000, approaching 530,000. But for months, people kept saying, oh no, that's not true. Now people are beginning to admit the truth. It's harder and harder to conceal these things. 500,000 plus have been wounded. You know, we're talking about a generation of Ukrainians whose lives have been destroyed. It's not going to last. But you would think if there were a shred of humanitarian interest in people in Ukraine, that Scholz and his colleagues would stand up and say, enough is enough. I mean, it is. Strikingly, when this war started, even the most renowned war correspondents wrote that Russia would lose within several months. Their armed forces were seen as totally outmoded, ancient even. They were using tanks which were considered completely out of fashion. People were ridiculing the Russian armed forces, making fun of them. I remember colleagues of yours or you would say, you know, professional soldiers, generals like General Petraeus and others saying, well, by February 2023, Mariupol will be reconquered. All these scenarios, what would you say after these 2 years now? What is your assessment of the Russian army from a military standpoint? How competent is Putin as a military leader, and how competent are these armed forces of Russia? A successful military commander always knows the limitations of his force as well as its potential. Without understanding limitations, you can't hope to be successful because you will demand either too much or too little of the force. He is someone who, I think from the very beginning, wanted a limited war, and he went in with very limited means only to discover that those means were inadequate. He corrected that problem, and today the Russian military is probably stronger, with higher morale, better discipline, better equipment, and better leaders at every level than it was in the 1980s. So I think it's probably the best of its kind, certainly in Eurasia, no question about it. And contrary to everybody's expectations, you know, Mr. Putin has been strongly supported in what he's done. Of course, there's always 15%, sometimes 20%, that doesn't like what any government does, but over 80%, I'd estimate 85 based upon what I heard just within the last couple of days, 85% of the Russian population, strongly supports what he's done. He's very reminiscent. This is going to sound strange to some of your listeners. He reminds me of Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded the 8th Army in North Africa. Remember, the 8th Army had been beaten to a pulp. You know, over 250,000 men could not stand up to 34,000 Germans and 70,000 Italians. He understood he had a morale problem. He understood that he needed new training, new leadership, new equipment. He took his time and built a better force. And then once he launched the force, it was very successful all the way through to the end of the Second World War, with a few minor exceptions. That's exactly what Mr. Putin and his generals have done. They built a very good force, but never pushed it too far, too fast. They avoided unnecessary casualties and took advantage of what we call the revolution in military affairs, which very simply is the links between space-based surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, and strike systems from mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles. And he's annihilated the Ukrainians, who repeatedly played into his hands and attacked the absolutely impregnable defensive forces that were built to cover the flanks, so to say, of this force that was being built up. It's worked brilliantly. We still haven't figured it out. We don't understand it. We haven't learned it. And people like Petraeus and others gave the Ukrainians terrible advice because they treated the Russian military establishment as some sort of backward World War II anachronism that could be defeated by a modernized World War II force. It's failed miserably. But again, you know, they are on the winning side, these retired generals and politicians, because they're well subsidized. They're well paid for having said what they did. Remember, the truth doesn't matter. That's the sad part. It's the message, the narrative that counts. And if you supply the narrative and you pay people to repurpose and repeat the narrative over and over and over again, then you eventually convince everybody it's true. And remember, most Americans were never interested in Eastern Europe. So when you step forward and say, well, all of these retired generals are wrong, people look at you sort of with a blank stare. Really? Well, they're generals, aren't they? I mean, this is pathetic. It's tragic. The same thing's true in Great Britain. We have lots of blowhards who are senior officers over there predicting the same nonsense. Well, I think most of what you've said is accurate. And again, I go back to what I said earlier about Putin. Let's hope that Mr. Putin remains in office for the foreseeable future, because he's the one who does share your orientation towards the West, particularly towards Germany. He's someone who knows history, and he knows that the two world wars were anomalies. Those were exceptions in the history of the German and Russian-speaking peoples. The majority of Germans were always doing business with Russia and vice versa. He sees it in those terms and would ultimately like to see that happen again. Having said that, he would like to have good relations with Poland, and he's made that very clear on numerous occasions. So that much, I think, is true. It's a mistake to attach too much significance to this Chinese thing, in the sense that there are some problems there. China and Russia are perfectly made for each other. Why? Because Russia has all the resources, the abundance of minerals, you name it, and the agricultural products that China desperately needs. China needs oil. It needs coal. China consumes virtually all the coal that it mines for itself. It needs millions of tons more than that just to run its industries. It does not have vast natural gas pipelines all over the country, but it can distribute coal via trains and rail and road. There are a lot of things that the two need from each other, but that doesn't mean that there's hostility. Neither is interested in fighting the other. And remember, they both share similar views in terms of who is a future possible opponent. And that possible opponent is right now us. Though I think that will diminish in the future because we're losing interest in this nonsense. There's no reason for us to be in Asia with military power. That's all nonsense. The Chinese are not an aggressive military power. So, what do the Russians and Chinese share in terms of a view of the future? It's called Japan. Japan is a juggernaut. Japan is unlike any other country in Asia. Japan is a hugely powerful scientific industrial state with excellent armed forces that could overnight defeat anything sent against them. Now, the Japanese don't want war either, okay? Let's not get confused. But if you're Russian and you're Chinese, you worry about us, but you say, well, the Americans, they may pull out anyway. They're not in Asia, but who's here to stay? Who do we worry about? That's Japan. There are a lot more reasons for the Russians and the Chinese to cooperate than to struggle with each other, so I wouldn't attach too much significance to that. But everything else you've said is true, and I don't think that's a new development in Russian history. And I hope that someone in Berlin wakes up, smells the coffee, and recognizes this all nonsense by the way, if you look at what happened with the Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream 1 back in the 50s and the 60s, The United States went to great lengths to ensure that the EU did not buy natural gas or oil from Russia. To the extent that we could, we obstructed it then. We've obstructed it again recently during this Russo-Ukrainian war. Why? Because at the time it was the Cold War and we were trying to isolate the Soviet Union, which represented an existential threat to us in the West. It was real. That's not true today. There's no reason for it. The Europeans need to wake up and figure that out. The Russians, by the way, if you were sitting in Moscow and you looked west and you look at what's going on in Germany, Sweden, France, my God, why would you want anything to do with managing those countries? Those societies are in trouble. Those countries are in turmoil. The Russians aren't interested in that. They want to ensure that their society survives and flourishes. So the whole thing, the whole business about Russian offensives aimed at the West is just nonsense. It's got to go away. Let me make a 10-minute video on this topic.